Hello, my name is Richard Garrett. I am the lead presenter for this session at the Achieving the Dream Data Summit. This plenary session is entitled Lighting Up Your LMS, Disaggregating Data to Increase Equity in the Classroom. I'm going to kick us off with some big picture data and commentary about online learning and community colleges with a focus on the global pandemic we're currently living through. As I said, my name is Richard Garrett. I am the Chief Research Officer at Eduventures. If you don't know Eduventures, we're a research and consulting firm focused on higher education. We've been around about 30 years, and these days we're part of NRCCUA, which is the well-known enrollment data and management firm, and together we're now part of ACT. I'm going to share my screen and take you through a few slides to kick off this session. So, CLOE 5 and community colleges betting on online learning. What is CLOE 5? If you're not familiar with CLOE, CLOE stands for the Changing Landscape of Online Education, and it's a multi-year joint initiative between Eduventures and Quality Matters. And I'd like to acknowledge Ron Lagon, my CLOE co-director, and also Eric Fredrickson, who is a CLOE co-author and who is the Chief Online Officer at University of Rochester. So let's set the scene for this discussion. Two interesting contrasting data points capture the significance of online learning for community colleges right now. The College Crisis Initiative at Davidson College tracked college opening plans through the summer leading up to the fall in the middle of the pandemic. And you can see as of October the 1st, community colleges stood out as being far more likely than average to report that their fall plans were either fully online or primarily online, more so than public four-year and much more so than private four-year institutions. Then from the National Student Clearinghouse, we've got early fall 2020 enrollment data. This may not prove quite right as more schools report and as more time passes, but chances are it's indicative of the overall trend. And here we saw community colleges reporting a steep decline in enrollment, down almost 8% year over year, compared to a small 0.4% drop for public four-year schools, and in the middle, a negative 3.8% decline for private four-year schools. So is there any association between this majority fully or primarily online fall stance for community colleges and this marked enrollment decline, coming as it does on the heels of a number of years of year-over-year decline in enrollment for two-year schools for a variety of reasons we don't get into now, but this decline is much, much sharper. So let's think about online learning and community colleges. So pre-pandemic, I would say, as in most sectors, online learning grew up organically, bottom up rather than top down. The main value of online courses and programs was flexibility and convenience for otherwise campus-based students. About 20% of undergraduates at community colleges took at least one online course last year, or thereabouts, and another 15% studied entirely online. And these ratios are likely a bit higher if we're talking about adult learners at community colleges and in certain fields of study. But I would argue that convenience trumped pedagogy in terms of appeal and effectiveness. Asynchronous online learning was very much the norm, self-paced, text-based discussion type online courses, and there was an emphasis on parity of quality rather than explicit cost or price reduction. And I'd say much of the literature points to an online completion deficit. If you took an online course, other things being equal, you were less likely to complete it than if you took a regular course on campus at community colleges. Although there's some evidence that this gap has closed over time, but it may just be the steady mainstreaming of online courses. Mid-pandemic, we had the sudden pivot to a remote spring, for essentially all schools, all students across the country. Arguably, this was less disruptive for community colleges, given that they generally did not offer student housing and had a less elaborate campus life. As the spring turned into summer, fall planning was unclear. It waxed and waned, more likely to open, less likely to open as the pandemic took its course. Arguably, schools and faculty in community colleges and elsewhere were better prepared in the fall than they were in the spring. But the inherent uncertainty as to what was going to happen, what was the best move, I think inhibited the scope for many institutions to really plan for a single model decided months in advance rather than hedging their bets as the summer moved on. And we've clearly got, whether we're talking community colleges or otherwise, lingering concerns about the online student experience versus the campus norm, price and value concerns. But again, is this less of an issue at otherwise low-priced and, in the best sense of the word, transactional community colleges? And in that sense, did community colleges have an advantage going into a pandemic? And does that explain why a majority of community colleges said that they were going to continue fully or majority online in the fall? And then looking forward post-pandemic, what role is online learning going to play? I think everyone is convinced online is going to play a bigger role throughout higher education. Will the pandemic, in any sense, force community colleges to get more strategic about online, a bit more top-down where it makes sense, more consolidation, more consistency, more coherence about what online learning looks like, what tools online learning consists of, what pedagogies are employed? Can online really start to be a strategic asset for community colleges beyond basic flexibility and convenience and choice? Equally, might we find that because of the pandemic and forced online learning, we may actually see an acute nostalgia for getting back to normal, getting back to the campus, and that may actually dissipate online learning momentum. So let's turn to some CLOE 5 data from this spring to zoom in on the reality of online learning arrangements in the emergency remote pivot, focusing in on community colleges. And what does it tell us about the potential as well as the pitfalls of online learning going forward? Let's set the scene with some comparative data. We asked in the CLOE 5 survey, this is a survey of chief online officers, the folks by whatever title in charge of online learning across US higher education. And our sample here is about 65 community colleges and then another 200, 250 or so other kinds of institution, primarily four-year schools, public and private. We asked, going into the pandemic, how many unique face-to-face courses, how many total course sections, and you can see community colleges arguably had an advantage. Less institutional complexity, less curriculum spread compared to four-year schools, just fewer courses that had to be converted rapidly from face-to-face to online. So arguably that's an advantage. But then when we look at resources, and in this case we're focusing on instructional designers, you can see that community colleges had far less resource than four-year schools. On average, just one full-time instructional designer back in December 2019, an average of essentially zero or less than a 1 FTE part-time instructional designer, and then projecting forward, really no new investment, not surprising given the budgetary pressure that community colleges were under generally, never mind in the midst of a global emergency. When we look at the percentage of community college faculty with no prior online teaching experience, we can see again, arguably community colleges had an advantage. Fewer chief online officers from two-year schools said that they had a high ratio of full-time or part-time faculty. In fact, that sector was least likely to report a high ratio. But the gaps aren't huge. And similarly, when it comes to the proportion of undergraduates with no prior online learning course experience, community colleges had the lowest ratio there, but again, the gap between, say, public two-year and public four-year was not particularly large. So arguably a modest community college advantage. So what happened in the spring based on Chloe 5 data from May? Here, and I'm being selective with these slides, there's a lot more data, and you can read the full Chloe 5 report freely available online on our website at Eduventures and also at the Quality Matters website. Here we were asking, how was the spring 2020 pivot organized, bottom up versus top down? And you can see community colleges, like all other types of schools, said essentially individual faculty took the lead. A bottom-up faculty-led culture, but less so in community colleges, as you might expect. And also community colleges were most likely to say that the spring pivot was organized by an equal collaboration between faculty, academic departments, and an institution. But as at most other schools, community colleges were rarely saying that faculty worked within a coherent institutional framework around online course design and development. We then asked what resources were devoted to the spring pivot, where was significant additional expense devoted, and here we're contrasting community colleges against various other types of institution, and here enterprise refers to institutions with more than 7,500 fully or partly online students, schools that are devoted to online in a significant way. You can see, regardless of institutional type, the most common source of significant spending was technology, purchases and licenses, and then you also see laptops for students coming in third, and then the second most common was faculty training and professional development. All that makes sense, but it's interesting, I think, that student orientation to online, given that many students, a large minority at least, had no prior online course experience. It's interesting that schools thought faculty development was much more important than student orientation, at least in terms of resources. And was that the right balance of priorities? Perhaps not, given the challenges we know many two-year students face with online. It may be appealing, but the additional self-motivation, self-discipline required for often substantially self-paced online courses can be very challenging for the typical community college student. We then asked about the variety of tools and technologies that were used in the remote spring. And here we're contrasting the overall Chloe 5 sample in green versus the community college sample in orange. And you can see heavy emphasis on the left, almost universal use. And here we're looking at the proportion of chief online officers that said this particular tool or technology was either universally deployed in the spring or was widely used. So LMS, video conferencing, very high ratios. Everything else, more or less a minority or small majority. Community colleges typically look like the rest of higher education with a few exceptions. Community colleges more likely to say they employed universally or widely remote proctoring. Also more likely to say that for e-textbooks and publisher resources, which may be consistent with heavier OER use in community colleges, and also more likely to deploy student support and retention tools and technologies. And though the ratio is very small on the far right, community colleges more likely to say they resorted to third-party courses rather than doing everything in-house. And I think the question here is this distribution a reflection of the particularities of community colleges, or does it indicate where online learning is going in US higher education as a whole? More emphasis on buying in high quality, low price, perhaps even immersive, adaptive textbooks and resources from third parties. More attention to student support around the edges of online courses, and then perhaps even saying, let's not do everything ourselves, let's outsource where it makes sense, right down to full courses. We then asked about multiple versus single solutions and the extent of cloud adoption for these various tools and technologies, and here's a subset of them. And you can see interesting patterns. So for video conferencing, which is still relatively new in terms of a major emphasis on online learning in US higher education, we see high adoption forced by the pandemic, but very low instances of single solutions, so schools juggling lots of different solutions at this stage, but pretty high cloud orientation. LMS is the only one where you see high ratios for all three: high adoption, high single solution, and high cloud, which is indicative of the relative maturity of that solution type. And I won't go through all the options, but you can certainly see for the others, it's still low adoption in significant terms, more likely to be multiple solutions rather than single solutions, and cloud is at best low majority of community colleges. And I think this is indicative of, in some areas, maturity and standardization of online learning, but in other areas, still colleges are finding their feet, figuring out which tool, which combinations of tools, whether we should host, whether we should outsource. The relative immaturity of online learning, even though online learning has almost a 30-year pedigree in US higher education, and community colleges are often at the forefront of that trend. So looking ahead, what's next? We asked chief online officers at community colleges and other institutions about how they were going to improve the remote learning experience if fall had to be substantially remote, which has certainly proven the case. And chief online officers indicated an interesting mix of things. And we're asking about, are they going to require all remote courses to meet a common set of quality standards? Are they going to expect all online courses to employ a common course template, so on and so forth? And you can see an interesting mix of responses. We do see some community colleges, large minority, small majority, say, yes, we are going to require all remote courses to do all these things: adhere to a common set of quality standards, employ a common course template, employ common tools and technologies, minimum expectations for faculty-student interaction, enhanced professional development and training, and enhanced student orientation. But you can also see lots of chief online officers saying, no, we're not going to require it. We're going to implement it, but it's going to be optional, or it's going to vary widely by remote courses, by departments, or in fact, we're not going to do this at all. And in this sense, it's not shown here, but community colleges, I would argue, on these questions were indicative of somewhat greater coordination, standardization than four-year schools, but the gap was not particularly large. And within each sector, not least community colleges, we saw a lot of variety, suggesting schools are still uncertain as to how much they can coordinate, centralize, standardize in the interest of a stronger, more coherent student experience, versus where they feel they have to be bottom up, be organic, either because they feel it's going to result in a superior outcome, or it just goes with the cultural grain. And is a pandemic, strong though it is, powerful enough to shake some of those cultural norms and assumptions? So last slide, just thinking through some implications of the CLOE 5 data and the longer term trend and implications when it comes to online learning and community colleges. I would say community colleges are in general online leaders. Pre-pandemic, community colleges exhibited the most consistent and distributed implementation of online learning. It was much more of a sector-wide effort rather than some schools do it, some schools don't, which is more the case among four-year schools. And I would say that that backdrop partly explains why community colleges were most likely to say in fall 2020 they were going to be primarily or wholly online. However, we do have, I think, the sustained tension between raw appeal of online learning for busy, non-traditional students with lots of other things going on in their lives, and then a delivery mode that often requires more self-discipline, more self-motivation, is perhaps more isolating than the campus norm, and therefore you have this tension that can mean, yes, online courses can fill up fast, but also they can often complete at lower than average rates. And clearly lower funding per student, lower spend per student at community colleges generally, never mind now, inhibits how developed, sophisticated, and rich online learning experiences and support arrangements on average can be. We've seen from CLOE 5 there's a lot of debate and flux still about which systems, which combinations of systems, whether to have one system, whether to have multiple systems, whether to support it in-house, whether to put it in the cloud with a partner. And I think that is leading to unhelpful friction around what pedagogies, what support arrangements, and ultimately inflating and obfuscating cost in an environment where schools need to control costs wherever possible and, where feasible, pass on those costs to the student. Should community colleges be further along on some of these things given their arguably stronger starting point compared to four-year schools? And should schools really try and better balance what I might call rational coordination of online learning in the interest of superior student experience and outcomes versus a culture, even in community colleges, of disaggregation and dissemination across departments, courses, and faculty? And then final point, I think community colleges need to, as I put it, transcend a transactional approach to online learning. Low cost, self-paced online by itself is not a great fit for most community college students. And it's always been there, but I would say we're in the midst of a rise, maybe it's just a fad, of what are called career navigation companies, private initiatives often backed by foundations and others, to try and streamline, rationalize what some see as a disconnect between underskilled, underemployed, lower income workers and various job opportunities. And these career navigation efforts combine intense job specific training and then placements with partner employers, and they often target adults without degrees, the exact community college target audience. And I would say this requires community colleges to clarify the value add of the education portion, not just training, not just job placement, but what is the more holistic, integrated, transferable skill set that can adapt to changing circumstances rather than just meet the need of a particular job or industry at a single point in time. And online learning, insofar as it will add value, must support these fundamentals for community colleges. So I think community colleges need to fashion a more compelling campus online hybrid that gets the best of both delivery modes, rather than it's just a matter of choice or it's just a matter of faculty preference. I think there is the potential for a pedagogic sweet spot between campus and online that balances deep student engagement and learning and retention and achievement with the convenience and flexibility that non-traditional community colleges students need, and in the bargain also helping to manage costs and keep price and debt and defaults down. So as the title says, and this is what I'll leave you with, I think community colleges need to find their campus online hybrid in order to reestablish their niche in the midst of a more crowded market, four-year schools encroaching on their territory, these new career navigation companies encroaching on their territory. Community colleges need to reassert who they are, what their niche is, where they add value. So thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, you can reach me at that email address, and I look forward to the conversation in the Meet the Expert session later in the day. Thank you, and I will stop sharing. And thanks very much. Talk to you soon.